internet. Friends, Americans, fellow planetary cohabitants, lend me your ears. These are really tumultuous times, and I think it's really easy to get lost in everything happening. And I'd like to talk about what all is happening on perhaps a somewhat deeper level than a lot of conversations happen. I think that what we're experiencing is essentially the death rattle of modernism and the world that modernism created will be passing away. As a way to explain that clearer, in the means that I'm discussing it, the modernism is the philosophical idea that the mind was the measure, the human mind was the measure of all things, and that it could create solutions to every problem that it could perceive, and thus the idea was born that all problems can be solved and have a technology that will solve them. Then the idea developed called postmodernism, which is the recognition that inherently, in order to quote-unquote solve a problem and provide a technological solution to it, there must only be one solution to that problem. This is all well and fine on certain technological issues, but this is really an ideology that seeks to resolve every aspect of human life, human existence. Every aspect of life can be technologically solved. And the best example of this, I think, that takes it beyond a purely obviously technological issue is something like the desire to end war in the world. War is a human problem. I mean, it's not only a human problem. Every other species that has the capacity to develop a competition with a neighbor will at some point undertake some form of competition to do that. One example would be ant colonies that go to war with each other. That's the best example of how conflict isn't really a human problem. It's a problem of life, not of a problem of humanity. And I think to some degree, the problems that are not human in nature or actually life in nature aren't so much problems as they are constraints, or rather, while they are problems, the only healthy solution to that problem is to define them as constraints and try to work around it. And that's sort of what the idea behind the UN was, that competition develops, and because there is no larger body for countries to go to resolve those disputes, they go to war. And so if we create a larger organization, then these countries, when they resort to these competitions, won't need to go to war. But of course, the UN hasn't actually ever prevented a war. We just left Afghanistan today. And the unfortunate reality of that is that every system will end up becoming an opportunity for a new form of power. And so the war simply moves up. And so the competition, instead of being between these nations, becomes between blocks of nations. NATO versus the Soviet republics and their allied states is as an example of something that developed after the war, operated extensively while the UN was in existence. And frankly, there were decades and decades of wars fueled primarily by superpowers, but essentially the existence of this other gubernatorial body kind of laundered intentions in a way. It becomes the rationalization for why things happen. Well, we tried to go to the UN, but they were blocking us, so we're going to have to go to war because they're subverting this international system. How can we allow them to get away with that? We can't. So the system itself, the system that was designed and developed in order to alleviate the pressures of war, become the new means of said war. To a large degree, the modern era, from an American foreign policy standpoint, you've probably, or maybe you've heard of the idea of McDonald's diplomacy, which is the idea that the U.S. had never been in a major conflict with any country that had a McDonald's in it. Now, it wasn't really about that fast food chain or the fact that there was a store there. It was an indicator of close economic ties. And so the system and this outlook was developed where if we have economic interests and they have economic interests with us, then that will eliminate the opportunity to have war. And therefore that will eliminate war. But actually, as it was a system to eliminate war, it became the new means of war. And so this is what really created the international outsourcing movements to prevent international military competition by expanding international economic competition, creating massive amounts of unemployment and all sorts of other things in, we'll say, the source nations of those economic ties. So, in order to eliminate international hardship, you create domestic hardship. Systems really don't eliminate problems, they actually kind of move problems around. And I think that the underlying reason for this is because survival requires a certain amount of resources. Just as a simple mathematic requirement. I mean, you need a certain number of calories, a certain amount of vitamins and minerals, and a certain amount of water, and a certain amount of oxygen, let alone any of the non-biological needs that a human has. And so these modern systems that were created to solve problems really kind of just shifted the problems around. But in the process, requiring changes from the people underneath those systems in order to be, quote unquote, compliant with that system. So, postmodernism came back and looked at the issue of modernism, and that it forces this singularity and this singularism, and it essentially just defines everything as relative. There is nothing that is true, there is only things true for you. And that's why what the modernist world or the modernist order was intending to create was essentially chewed up by the realization that in order to achieve the things that those systems were manifest to do, you have to accept that nothing is real, nothing is true, because those problems never really get solved, they simply get moved, and the system just defines those problems as having been solved, even though they actually just moved. And so we are now getting to the point where the rejection of singular purpose is devouring the last of the things that were manifestations of that modern idealized world where we can simply design technological solutions to eliminate all of our problems. Because we need to accept a problem solved at the same... Here's another way to think about it. In order to consider a problem solved, everybody needs to be willing to accept that whatever end state develops is a quote-unquote solution. But that solution doesn't necessarily actually work for everybody. It doesn't necessarily solve anybody's problems. And postmodernism, as a result of the fact that it simply rejects that the notion that things could be true, refuses to accept that things that it says are true, are in fact untrue. Essentially requiring people to simply concede authority, their own authority to control their own lives, to an external source who has defined what the proper solution to the needs of your life is. To a large degree, I think that the war in Afghanistan and the war in Iraq may be one of the final quote-unquote moves made towards that modernist vision of one world with everybody's problems solved technologically. And it was inevitable. It was very much inevitable. Because reality has a liberal bias. But that word does not mean left wing. That word means open. Reality has a liberal bias. Reality is open. It's biased towards everybody agreeing on it. Because if you're trying to convince somebody that something that is visibly, obviously untrue is true, it's not going to work. Everybody needs to be willing to buy into it, to perceive it as reality. But words are interesting tools. They're living things in their own right. Although their life is not their own, their life is directed by conscious people, by the people that wield those ideas. The world has an underlying idea that binds it together. And what that idea is determined by the people that occupy that world. And not everybody agrees with that worldview. And where the fractures between those worldviews are essentially create societies. A society is actually a group of people who believe that the world works in the same way. Historically, a society was pretty contiguous on a geographic basis, for the most part. There are a lot of significant exceptions, but for the most part, for a society to have cohesion, or what it means when a society has cohesion, is that that society agrees on how the world works. And when that society ceases to agree on how the world works, it's no longer actually a society. It is simply a populace that shares geospatial proximity. If you take 25 people at random and stick them into a gymnasium, they're not a society. If you lock them in there for 25 years, they will develop a society. They will all very much agree on how the world works. But simply being present in the same place doesn't mean that you perceive the world in the same way. And that is a very true assertion that came out of postmodernism. But the interesting thing about postmodernism is that it didn't build anything of its own to replace the modernist worldview. In my opinion, to a large degree, because postmodernists saw extraordinary power up for the grabs from the mechanisms that were built to manifest modernism. And because postmodernists don't believe anything is true, they simply continued along the same path previously prescribed to quote-unquote solve the problems, with now the realization in hand, however, that they were not solving any problems. They were simply using existing issues to craft a greater and greater amount of power. And what we are, in my opinion, what we are seeing right now is the shredding of the illusion that we were still operating in a modernist framework. And so I anticipate that in the coming time period, we will continue to see a collapse of any institution that was built to manifest this modernist idea of a singular world whose every problem was solved by technology. And I believe that one of the many manifestations that you see of that is rejection of vast swaths of people pointing out problems, and a denial of the existence of the problems that people are highlighting, and a rebranding of people based on how they are perceived on the spectrum of, frankly, realizing where we are in history. The modern era was crafted to a large degree as a means to maintain power. Trying to meet the needs and obligations of people. And then people realized that it was failing. But rather than addressing that failure, we simply altered terms and continued to alter terms and continued to deny what had simply recently happened as a means to keep the ball rolling forward. But there is a cohesion that is required for a society to be a society. And because that is a fundamental, we're talking laws of physics kind of level of reality, it defines how people interact, regardless of whether or not we want it to be that way. Things are the way that they are. And as a result of this, because people are unwilling to recognize legitimacy of other people's concerns, they will simply ignore each other. And this will create a situation that is only possible because of the technological solutions that we have at our disposal in this time. But there will essentially, what had been singular societies within geographic boundaries all got stitched together, wrapping around the entire world throughout the modern era. That was really the goal of that. And it was not a bad goal to unite countries through trade, to hypothetically improve the conditions that people are living with around the planet is a good thing. But that's not what happened. It's how it was sold to the places that were losing jobs, was that it was better for the world, frankly, and that it was selfish to worry about it. But what that actually happened was labor needs were moved to places where there were no labor laws. And so slavery flourished through the modern era. Corporate slavery, but slavery nonetheless. And I'm not talking about office drones. I'm talking about legitimate forced labor, child labor in mines, devastating things that, were it happening in front of the people who were sold this story, would never have flown. The Western world abolished child labor. But then the labor was outsourced to places where that had not been abolished. Still to this day, it's happening. And rather than acknowledge that, corporations decided to simply define that problem away. Xinjiang is a good example of horrendous labor conditions that exist purely because people refuse to accept the terms. Concentration camp's a concentration camp. These are not people who did anything wrong other than be born in a way that a certain group of people don't like. It's pretty horrible stuff. But they just define away the problem. They deny the existence of the words that you're using. This is deceptive, but effective, especially when corporate interests are willing to pretend that the things that are being said are true. And so we're now at a point where systems that were developed to solve problems, i.e. poverty around the world, that is part of why manufacturing was moved out of the US, at least as a sales pitch, was improving the lives of places where there wasn't a lot of opportunity. And then they demanded that you not look at what they were doing with that quote-unquote opportunity. And then when people got video footage of it, they called them crazy and denied that it even existed. Because the lure of that profit was simply too high. But the interesting thing that's developed is a level of technology and information sharing that really eliminates the ability for a lot of different kinds of lies. But the people who want the lie to survive own the biggest technology and control the most of it. So, we find ourselves in a situation where all around the world, people have fundamentally different ideas of what makes the world go round. And along those lines of how people perceive the world, let's call that a worldview. People are able to connect with other people who share their worldview all around the world. And so, whereas 100 years ago, you would have a very high likelihood of having the same perceptions of the world as somebody that lives down the street from you, because they are your source for information. You share sources for information. You both read the same newspaper that's printed, a mile down the road. Listen, there's just not that much opportunity for people to connect in a way that was not in some way bounded by geography. And we now live in a time where geography has very little to do with communication at all. Very little to do with information sharing. And so what we have now is, rather than a singular society that occupies a geographic territory that is adjacent to another singular society that's occupying a geographic territory, all of these societies are overlaid over top of each other, and the boundaries on a map between them have very little to do with how people understand the world and perceive the world. And this is essentially a rising era of, I guess, what they're calling network societies. So rather than everybody in one block of the city having the same ideas, you may be 100% on board with the same worldview as somebody halfway around the planet and have nothing, see nothing the same as the person that lives down the street from you. And that creates a lot of friction. And the only way to mitigate friction is lubricant. Here's one: alcohol, bourbon. America's gift to the drinking world. Goodness, that's good. So, as we experience the unfolding of the death rattle of modernism, the legitimacy of postmodernism as a functional, workable ideology will be tested. Now, the issue will be that because it is an ideology that does not believe that anything is true, they will deny their failures. They will claim that their failures are a failure of somebody else or aren't actually a failure at all, because that's really how they perceive the world. But I don't believe that most people are on board with that ideology. I don't think that most people really buy into modernism either, though. It died. It's really legitimately dying. I firmly believe that through this lens, the war in Afghanistan makes more sense than through anything that they use to sell that war. Which, anyway. The purpose was to institute democracy in a place that had no strong desire for it to begin with. And it was ill-fated from the beginning because we were trying to sell an idea that is antithetical to how they perceive the world. And so it was quite literally always doomed to fail. The Afghanistan war, as its nation-building nature that it wound up developing, was doomed to failure from the moment they decided to do it. Now, whether that was authentically the reason for the invasion or not, I mean, we did not actually find Osama bin Laden there. Keep that in mind. They liberated a lot of poppy fields, but they wound up finding Osama bin Laden in Pakistan. The poppy fields were then shipped to China, where they were converted to opioids, and a mere few years after the invasion of Afghanistan, we had an opioid crisis. And the opioid crisis created a massive amount of medical debt and a lot of death and a lot of dependency. And dependency is highly profitable for a government. Dependency is the easiest way to guarantee a vote. Because if you're dependent, that vote isn't a choice. There's no need to sell somebody that you're the better candidate if they are already dependent upon you. So you don't actually need to solve a problem if the person suffering from that problem is dependent upon you already. There are a lot more ways to lie than there are to be honest. And there are a lot more ways to live life than just one. And I believe that the only ethical locus for the decision and the responsibility over yourself is yourself. Any system that will remove your responsibility from you to define how you want to live your life is actually making you dependent. responsibility is required for independence. If you don't have responsibility, then you do not have independence. In essence, if somebody else makes them responsible for you, you become a serf to them, or we can choose other words. And so we are likely going to see a very significant sales pitch by people who do not believe that anything is true. And that sales pitch will be that they have the solutions that will make your problems go away. But in reality, problems don't go away. They just move. Matter cannot be created or destroyed. Energy cannot be created or destroyed. These are physical realities. These physical realities don't only pertain to the physical world. They also exist in the realm of ideas. There is an underlying mental world, let's say. You have your physical body, and your mind perceives the physical world around your physical body and draws conclusions about the past, the present, and the future from those experiences. And while you have your own mental world, there's also a shared mental world. It's like you have your neighborhood of your ideas, but that neighborhood exists within a larger society. And that larger society is essentially an emergent phenomenon. It's not definable by anybody else. It's organic. It grows from what we believe. The more people that believe A, the more people believe A, right? And so if everybody believes A, then that is the dominant idea in this mental space. Used to be that most people in America believed capitalism was superior to Marxism, to socialism. But to a large degree, because of the collapsing economic picture within the United States, because of exportation of labor to maximize profits for corporations, it's gotten pretty ridiculous. A lot of people with a lot of debt because of, frankly, failed political systems. Systems which promised solutions. And we bought into them because we didn't realize there were no solutions. There is no solution to the fact that people need other than eliminating humans, which I'm not on board with. But let me hear your argument. Just be honest. Depraved as the world may be, it happens a lot. It's happening right now in China. Arguably around the world. But I'd like to track and follow the developments in this arena. But in addition, and more than that, I want to create a mental model to share for you to think about how the systems that exist were sold versus how they actually operate. And an understanding of what that means in terms of how we should try to move forward. Because these are strange, strange times. And if we don't understand each other, things get far, 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 far worse. There's no real way to know that your perceptions about the meanings of things were shifted unless you really get down to an ideological understanding of the things that are being discussed. And everything that exists is a tool, other than people. Don't use people as tools. Everything that exists, every tool can become a weapon. And I'd like to have you join me for a conversation about how that works. So, I'd like you to subscribe, hit that like button, and make sure you request all notifications. Thanks. Have a nice day.